Summer Wells' name vanished from the FBI missing children database at the same time TBI launched its largest search in 4 years on a secluded property nearly 10 miles from her home. Hours later, a private investigator revealed an anonymous caller's message. Tell him to turn himself in while he still can. And almost instantly, one old photograph of Candace fishing was thrust into the spotlight, transforming a harmless image into a new theory about Van Hill. So why did investigators target Van Hill now? Let's watch today's episode to learn more about the new evidence. The photograph that would later ignite one of the most widespread misinterpretations in the Summer Wells case was taken long before the disappearance itself. On March 26, 2020, Candace Bly posted an image of herself fishing beside a calm body of water, a snapshot that, at the time, carried no investigative weight and drew little attention. For more than 4 years, the picture existed online without controversy, without scrutiny, and without any meaningful connection to the events of June 15, 2021. It was simply one of many images showing the family's outdoor routine. Yet this same photograph would eventually be elevated into a central investigative hypothesis, not because of what it showed, but because of when it resurfaced. The renewed attention had little to do with the content of the photo itself, and everything to do with the timing of an unexpected development in the case. That development occurred on November 13, 2024, when the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation abruptly announced a large-scale search operation on a privately owned property along Van Hill Road, approximately 9.6 miles from the Wells residence. This was not a routine sweep, not a follow-up on a previously established grid, and not part of the early case ground searches conducted across Hawkins and Sullivan counties. This was a warrant-based investigative action, something that had not happened publicly for years. For the first time since the early months of the investigation, TBI disclosed an active lead substantial enough to justify a coordinated presence involving multiple agencies. That alone marked a significant departure from their long-standing posture of controlled silence. The timing of this public disclosure created a vacuum that the online community immediately rushed to fill. After years of stalled developments, a sudden and unexplained search invited speculation. And because TBI offered no elaboration, no description of the lead, no identifying details, no indication of what evidence they were seeking, the community attempted to establish its own narrative. The fishing photograph quickly became a focal point of that effort. Users began comparing the waterline, tree line, and bank structure in Candace's 2020 image to publicly available satellite views of the Van Hill property. The pond located near the search driveway became the presumed match, even though the picture predated the disappearance by more than a year and no official link existed between Candace and that property. The acceleration of speculation was further amplified by 2 additional developments that emerged in parallel. The first was the widely circulated but unverified claim that Summer Wells's profile had been removed from the FBI's missing children database. Although there is no official confirmation explaining the timing or rationale, such removals occur only under a limited set of conditions. Each of those scenarios carries investigative implications, including potential shifts in case classification or jurisdiction. With no official commentary available, the community interpreted the removal as an indicator that federal agencies might possess information the public did not yet know. The absence of transparency created a perception that something had changed behind the scenes, and that perception intensified scrutiny of the Van Hill search. The second development involved a statement made by private investigator Jason Jensen, who revealed that he had recently received a tip from an anonymous caller claiming to know the identity of the individual responsible for Summer's disappearance. According to Jensen, the caller made a pointed request: tell him to turn himself in while he still can. While no details were released regarding the credibility of the tip, or whether it correlated with the lead that triggered the Van Hill operation, the timing was notable. It contributed to a broader sense that multiple vectors, digital, verbal, and investigative, were converging. That convergence, even without confirmed relationships among the components, encouraged the public to draw connections regardless of evidentiary support. Within this environment, the phishing photograph became more than a simple image. It became a trigger point for a larger narrative that had no grounding in confirmed evidence, but was reinforced by coincidence, timing, and the human tendency to search for visual matches when official data is absent. The logic followed a familiar pattern in online investigations. If a new search occurs, and if a known image contains water, and if the searched property contains a pond, then the most straightforward conclusion is that the image depicts that pond. This form of visual assumption mapping bypasses forensic validation and instead relies on surface-level similarity. But in missing person cases, especially those with prolonged periods of investigative silence, such assumptions often gain traction rapidly. As a result, a photograph taken in 2020, one that had no documented investigative relevance, became the centerpiece of a hypothesis suggesting that Candace routinely visited the Van Hill location to fish, potentially establishing a behavioral connection to the property searched in 2024. That hypothesis spread widely, despite the absence of any official statement linking Candace to the land, the pond, or the owners. The theory persisted because it fit the storyline that the public was assembling a sudden search, a missing child, an anonymous tip, a removed FBI listing, and a picture of a woman by a pond. The pieces formed a pattern only because they were forced together. Forensic methodology, however, requires a reversal of that process. Instead of allowing timing and coincidence to dictate interpretation, the analysis must separate what is known from what is assumed. The only verified facts regarding the photograph are its date, its subject, and its existence online prior to Summer's disappearance. There is no documented connection between Candace and the Van Hill property. There is no statement from TBI indicating that recreational activity played any role in the search. There is no geographic or terrain-based match confirmed by professionals. And there is no evidence that the 2020 photograph was ever taken into custody as part of the case file. Yet the photograph still matters not because it reveals the location, but because it reveals the mechanism through which public narratives form. When a significant investigative event occurs without explanation, secondary artifacts like photos, rumors, or unverified sightings are rapidly elevated into central leads. This pattern requires a forensic reset. Each element must be reassessed from its origin, independent of the narrative constructed around it. Was the 2020 phishing photograph ever taken at Van Hill, or was the hypothesis itself built entirely on timing, coincidence, and assumption rather than evidence? This question forms the basis for the deeper analysis that follows. The renewed attention to the Summer Wells case did not begin with a rumor, a photograph, or an online theory, but with a documented law enforcement action. On November 13, 2024, the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation conducted what would become the most significant search effort since the early months following Summer's disappearance. This was not a community-organized sweep, not a drone-assisted volunteer effort, and not a follow-up inquiry on a previously canvassed area. Instead, it was a multi-agency operation involving the TBI, the FBI, and the Hawkins County Sheriff's Office acting together under the authority of a warrant. The scale alone distinguished it from the hundreds of tips and small-scale checks that had accumulated over the previous 4 years. TBI representatives confirmed publicly that the operation was based on an ongoing active lead. In other words, the search was not part of a cyclical revisit or periodic reevaluation of old locations, something seen in other long-term missing person cases. Instead, the language indicated a new stimulus, new information, or a newly assessed piece of existing information that warranted physical intervention. This clarification was narrow but meaningful. Law enforcement agencies rarely characterize a lead as active unless it meets internal thresholds for credibility, relevance, or corroboration. The public, however, was offered no details about the nature of the lead, who provided it, or whether it emerged from digital review, informant testimony, forensic reanalysis, or parallel investigations. The secrecy surrounding the lead was not unusual, but the acknowledgement of a lead at all was. For roughly 4 years, the TBI had maintained a strict communication pattern, periodic anniversary updates, reminders that no theory had been ruled out, and a consistent emphasis on the absence of new publicly shareable information. This communication strategy had created a predictable environment. When nothing was shared, nothing escalated. When nothing escalated, speculation remained contained. But the Van Hill operation was different. It was the first public sign in years that investigators had encountered something requiring immediate physical action. That break in routine formed the second major shock point in the case, following the unverified claim about Summers' removal from the FBI database. For the first time since the early ground searches, TBI's silence fractured. Understanding the significance of the November search requires examining what the presence of a warrant actually means. A search warrant is not issued on the basis of rumor or possibility. It requires probable cause, a legal threshold indicating that investigators believe evidence related to a crime exists at a specific location. Achieving that threshold usually demands the corroboration of multiple data points. It may originate from a witness statement that aligns with digital pings, physical trace, or behavioral patterns documented elsewhere. It may come from new information that recontextualizes older leads, or it may reflect a development arising outside the original investigative domain, such as a tip received by a private investigator or an indirect confession. Regardless of its origin, the court's approval signifies that law enforcement presented enough verified or verifiable information to justify intrusion onto private property. This is important because the public often assumes that long-term cases stagnate due to lack of evidence, but in reality, investigations frequently progress privately without visible action. The Van Hill search represented both progress and visibility. The progress derived from the existence of the lead. The visibility came from the physical presence of multiple agencies and the consequent media coverage. Without that visibility, the lead would have remained unknown to the public, and the fishing spot hypothesis, built largely on timing, may never have emerged. To contextualize the Van Hill location itself, it is necessary to consider the geography of the area. Contrary to a widely circulated misconception, Van Hill is not an isolated wilderness region removed from human habitation. The road includes businesses, residences, and multiple properties owned by the same extended family. The section that appears secluded is a single curved stretch where the tree line encloses the roadway, before opening again into another residential area. The pond associated with the searched property sits above the driveway, not directly adjacent to the road, and cannot be easily viewed without trespassing or drone violation of Tennessee's surveillance laws. The landscape is rural, but neither remote nor inaccessible. It is approximately 9.6 miles from Ben Hill Road, a distance that can be driven in 12 to 15 minutes under normal conditions. The location therefore carries investigative significance, not because it is hidden, but because of how it fits into a network of accessible rural properties that require minimal visibility to enter or exit. That characteristic is relevant to law enforcement, but bears no inherent relationship to recreational activities such as fishing. A fishing spot tends to reflect consistent patterns of visitation, familiarity with an environment, and ease of access. Nothing about the Van Hill property aligns with those elements in the documented behavior of the Wells family. The sudden appearance of the fishing spot hypothesis, built on the presence of a pond, rather than verified visitation, illustrates how assumption can override forensic methodology when public information is incomplete. The fact that the TBI search occurred on Van Hill does not suggest that Candace ever fished there. Investigators did not reference fishing, recreation, family habits, or personal movements related to the property. They focused exclusively on the lead and the potential evidentiary value of the location. Without disclosure of the lead's nature, the public filled the informational gap with visual interpretation of the 2020 photograph. That interpretation spread rapidly because it felt intuitive. A pond was searched. A pond appeared in a photograph, and timeline pressure created the illusion of correlation. From a forensic perspective, however, the presence of a pond does not imply recreational relevance. It may carry significance related to concealment, disposal, environmental trace retention, or entirely unrelated investigative vectors. The only fact connecting the Van Hill property to the case is the TBI's decision to execute a search there. No forensic analysis supports identifying the pond in the 2020 photograph as the same body of water. No documented behavioral pattern places Candace in that area, and no official statement links the search to any prior activity involving the Wells family. Ultimately, what happened on Van Hill Road on November 13th is straightforward. Law enforcement acted on a lead strong enough to justify a warrant and significant enough to break 4 years of controlled silence. What remains unclear is the nature of that lead, whether it aligns with external tips, or whether it emerged from internal investigative review. What is clear, however, is that the investigative significance of Van Hill cannot be assumed to overlap with public speculation. The fact that Van Hill warranted a search means the location holds real value to the investigation. But that value cannot be conflated with the fishing spot hypothesis, which developed independently and without evidentiary support. The forensic question moving forward is therefore not whether Van Hill was ever a fishing spot, but what evidentiary relationship, if any, the property holds to the disappearance of Summer Wells. The hypothesis that Candace Bly's favorite fishing spot was located on Van Hill Road persisted for months, not because it was supported by evidence, but because it was never subjected to a structured, forensic-level comparison. The assumption originated from a visual shortcut. The Van Hill property contained a pond. Candace had posted a photograph near a body of water, and the TBI had executed a search warrant on that same property. These three elements, when combined without analysis, created the illusion of coherence. However, when the photograph is examined through objective spatial markers, mountain alignment, architectural background, water characteristics, and hydrological behavior, the assumption collapses entirely. The data, once aligned, presents a conclusion that is unambiguous. The fishing photograph could not have been taken on the Van Hill property. The first critical marker visible in Candace's 2020 fishing photograph is the mountain ridge in the distance. Multiple independent analysts, as well as YouTube investigators, identified the peak as Bays Mountain, a prominent geological feature observable from specific locations in Kingsport, particularly around the Riverfront Park and Holston River Greenbelt corridor. Bays Mountain's profile is distinct, a rounded, continuous elevation rather than the segmented ridgelines common in the Van Hill area. When digitally mapped, the ridgeline visible in the photograph corresponds precisely to the view seen from Riverfront Park's fishing pull-offs and shoreline clearings, locations where Candace was previously photographed with Summer under the well-known bridge structure. Conversely, the Van Hill property offers no line of sight to Bays Mountain. The hill systems around the Van Hill Road bend comprise an entirely different formation, consisting of shorter, irregular rises that do not match the elevation, curvature, or skyline pattern seen in Candace's image. Satellite data and street-level footage confirm that Bays Mountain is not visible from any angle near the pond on Van Hill due to intervening topography. This alone makes the match impossible. In forensic image comparison, the orientation of major landforms is considered a high-confidence exclusion factor. If the mountain does not match, the location cannot match. The second primary visual marker in the photograph is the background structure, a long building with multiple evenly spaced windows. This building appears behind Candace and is positioned on the opposite side of a riverbank with a clear line of sight. Creators noted that the building closely resembles one constructed along the Kingsport Greenbelt Path, a facility adjacent to the Holston River, with a similar layout and window configuration. The ability to see such a structure from across the water is consistent with Riverfront Park fishing pull-offs, where the riverbank is wide and open, providing sweeping views of industrial and municipal buildings on the opposite shore. The Van Hill Pond, by comparison, is a retention-style water feature located on private property, elevated above the driveway and surrounded by trees. No large municipal or industrial building exists near the pond, let alone one with a long row of visible windows. The immediate environment around the Van Hill Pond consists of private structures, equipment storage, and wooded land. None of these match the buildings seen in the photograph. The absence of any similar architecture within the entire radius further reinforces that the photograph could not have been taken at Van Hill. Forensic image comparison relies heavily on background architecture as a stable identifier. and the mismatch here is absolute. The third component, the water itself, provides perhaps the most decisive forensic distinction. The water in Candace's photograph exhibits characteristics associated with the Holston River, particularly the stretch influenced by TVA generation cycles. The river's appearance fluctuates daily at non-generation times. The water level lowers, exposing rocky banks and creating mild surface movement. During generation, the water rises rapidly, becoming deeper and exhibiting stronger currents. In both conditions, however, the water maintains a certain turbidity and reflective quality typical of flowing river ecosystems. Several investigators noted the slightly uneven surface and coloration that indicates a moving body of water rather than a static one. The Van Hill Pond does not share these traits. It is a static basin with no measurable current, no TVA connection, and no hydrological inflow or outflow that would produce the surface patterns seen in the photograph. Retention ponds have uniform coloration and minimal surface disturbance. They are designed to hold water, not circulate it. The waterline in Candace's photograph shows a gradient consistent with a river edge, not the sharply defined edges typical of artificial ponds. Even the composition of the bank differs. The Holston River's edges include silt, shale fragments, and occasional riprap, whereas the Van Hill Pond's perimeter, as seen from available footage, displays a smooth, grassy incline. Depth indicators also diverge. Don B. described the Holston River's typical depth during non-generation periods, noting that the shallower areas near the banks are about 8–10 feet deep, with deeper central channels during generation. Depth perception across the river in Candace's photograph aligns with these hydrological expectations. No such depth conditions exist at the Van Hill Pond, which remains uniformly shallow. These environmental mismatches lead to the first clear forensic conclusion in the case. The 2020 fishing photograph cannot have been taken at the Van Hill property. Not one of the anchor markers, mountain profile, architectural background, hydrological behavior, or water characteristics aligns with the pond on Van Hill Road. When these markers are evaluated together, the probability of the Van Hill match falls to 0. Despite the clarity of this forensic exclusion, the hypothesis gained traction because the public rarely performs geometric or hydrological comparisons when interpreting images. The assumption that any pond could match any fishing photograph is a product of visual generalization, a cognitive shortcut that ignores the specificity of natural and built environments. Most viewers are not trained to assess mountain line orientation or water surface dynamics. Instead, they rely on similarity rather than accuracy. This lack of forensic evaluation created the space for the Van Hill hypothesis to flourish. Once TBI conducted a search on the property, timing superseded evidence. The image existed, the pond existed, and the search existed. Therefore, many concluded the elements were linked. The narrative formed not from verified data, but from the human instinct to connect visible dots. The failure to compare the physical markers allowed the theory to persist long after the available data would have disproven it. In cases like this, forensic geometry, the method of evaluating spatial relationships between topographical and structural features, is essential. When applied to the photograph, every measurable variable rules out Van Hill. Yet the public had never applied these methods. Many had never considered looking at mountain directionality or building alignment. Others assumed any natural body of water in the region could be visually interchangeable. And because official investigators did not release clarifying statements, the vacuum remained open for speculation to expand. The result was a theory built entirely on overlapping coincidences without a factual anchor. The appeal of the hypothesis came not from accuracy, but from convenience. The community needed a visible match, and the visible match they found was the one that happened to be in the news cycle. The photograph did not fit the location, but it fit the narrative. Forensic analysis corrects that error. Through detailed comparison across multiple spatial markers, the conclusion is definitive. The image aligns with the Holston River at the Kingsport Riverfront Park, not the pond on Van Hill Road. The photograph shows a location where Candace had documented presence, where Summer had been photographed under a known bridge, and where all environmental characteristics align. The Van Hill Pond shares none of these traits. The attraction of the Van Hill hypothesis, therefore, lies not in the evidence but in the absence of evidence. When official agencies do not explain their actions, the public fills the silence with interpretations. The photograph became a symbolic placeholder for clarity, even though the facts never supported it. The forensic task is to replace assumption with analysis, and the first step in that process is acknowledging what the photograph is not. It is not a Van Hill image, not a clue to Candace's recreational habits in that area, and not a key to explaining the TBI search. It is simply a misinterpreted artifact, elevated by proximity rather than accuracy. The question that remains is why so many were willing to accept the match without verifying the environmental markers, and whether the same pattern has affected other aspects of the case. The question of whether Candace Bly could have visited the Van Hill property as part of her routine, or on the day Summer disappeared, cannot be answered through speculation or visual interpretation alone. It requires strict reconstruction of time, distance, and movement. When the timeline provided by Candace is measured against the physical realities of the region, every scenario involving Van Hill collapses instantly. This collapse forms one of the most structurally important contradiction nodes in the entire case. The first anchor point, where the drive time between the Wells residence on Ben Hill Road and the searched property on Van Hill Road is measured. Under normal conditions, the distance of approximately 9.6 miles requires 12 to 15 minutes of travel each way. This time frame remains consistent regardless of moderate changes in speed or traffic, as the route consists primarily of rural backroads rather than variable urban conditions. The path is predictable, measurable, and verifiable by mapping software, GPS logs, and local knowledge. Because this drive time represents the minimum possible duration, any scenario involving both arrival and return requires at least 24 to 30 minutes, excluding time spent at the destination. This number alone is incompatible with Candace's own description of the day. In multiple interviews, she asserts that only a 2-minute window existed during which Summer was out of sight. These 2 minutes represent the period between Summer allegedly walking downstairs and Candace realizing she was missing. Even if this statement were imprecise, even if the real window were several minutes longer, the difference between a 2-minute gap and a 30-minute round trip remains insurmountable. The timeline Candace describes simply cannot accommodate a journey to Van Hill and back under any circumstance. The second anchor point involves the alternative travel scenario proposed by some theorists, that Candace may have traveled from Jonesboro toward Van Hill at some point in the afternoon. The fastest route from Jonesboro to the Van Hill property is approximately 37 minutes, with other routes taking up to 50 minutes, depending on direction of travel and road choice. Even the hypothetical scenario involving a stop at the Exxon near the Sullivan Gardens Parkway adds only further time, approximately 51 minutes total from Jonesboro to Van Hill, followed by 26 minutes from Exxon to the Van Hill property. These numbers make one fact clear: any route involving Jonesboro and Van Hill requires a minimum of 1 hour, without accounting for time spent at either location. This is fundamentally irreconcilable with the timeline Candace presents. No account she has ever given includes a 60 to 90-minute interval of untracked movement. Her statements describe a tightly contained sequence of events centered around the hospital visit, the swimming hole, the grocery trip, the drive home, and the final moment she claimed to have seen Summer. The Jonesboro route does not fit into any segment of this timeline without displacing or contradicting major events she asserts occurred. The third anchor point in the contradiction matrix comes from witness statements. A witness in the area near a church or day camp facility reported that Candace's truck was seen her most of the day. Another statement asserted that Summer was seen alive in her front yard hours after she left here. These are unverified witness claims, not law enforcement confirmed sightings, but they remain important as contradiction vectors because they directly challenge Candace's timeline. If Candace's truck remained in a specific area most of the day, then it could not have simultaneously been making extended trips to distant locations. Likewise, the statement that Summer was seen in her own yard hours after allegedly leaving the area introduces a temporal and spatial conflict. The witness is either mistaken or describing a scenario that cannot coexist with Candace's account. These contradictions do not establish guilt or deception, but they directly undermine the possibility that any portion of the day involved a journey to Van Hill. If Candace and her truck were observed consistently in one area, then the 24 to 30 minutes required for a Van Hill detour could not have occurred without those sightings breaking down. In forensic timeline reconstruction, multiple incompatible observations create a collapse point, where one or more narratives must logically fail. The fourth anchor comes from Candace's own description of her movements. In the interviews conducted shortly after Summer's disappearance, she repeatedly insisted that the entire day was tightly structured and monitored. She emphasized that she was with her mother, her 3 sons, and Summer for most of the day. She recounted specific locations visited: HCA emergency room, the swimming hole at Warriors Path, Walgreens, Priceless Foods, and specific intervals of time. In each version, the day is continuous, with no segment indicating she deviated or left the group for an extended period. Even if one assumes she misremembered or misstated minor details, the fundamental shape of her timeline leaves no room for the slow, rural travel required to reach Van Hill. These 4 anchor points: Ben Hill drive time, Johnsburg drive time, witness contradictions, and Candace's own statements converge into a single forensic conclusion. Candace could not have been at the Van Hill location on June 15, nor could Van Hill have been part of her regular fishing routine. The timeline excludes the possibility, and any attempt to force the location into the narrative contradicts multiple independent time and distance constraints. From a forensic standpoint, the behavior pattern associated with routine fishing further invalidates the Van Hill hypothesis. Regularly visited fishing spots typically share certain characteristics: ease of access, predictable parking, minimal travel distance from home, and known water conditions. Van Hill possesses none of these features. The pond is on private property, elevated above a driveway, enclosed by a wooded area, and not designed for public recreation. There is no record photographic, testimonial, or digital placing Candace at or near the property prior to the disappearance, and no evidence of habitual use. In contrast, the Kingsport Riverfront Park and its adjacent waterways align precisely with Candace's documented recreational behavior. She had been photographed in that area with Summer, and her family had visited the location multiple times in the past. The environment matches her habits: close to town, easy to access, familiar, informal, and consistent with the type of spontaneous outings she frequently described. Attempting to relocate her fishing habits to a private pond nearly 10 miles away contradicts every known behavioral pattern. This is why forensic analysis treats location viability not merely as a question of physical possibility, but as a convergence point of movement, behavior, and documented history. Van Hill fails at every level. This logic creates one of the strongest contradiction nodes in the entire investigation. When tested against the timeline Candace presents, the travel distances, witness statements, and behavior patterns eliminate the possibility that she visited Van Hill on June 15th or on any regular basis beforehand. The exclusion is not speculative, it is structural. Time cannot be expanded. Distances cannot be shortened. Witnesses cannot be in 2 places at once. When these variables are forced into alignment, Van Hill is expelled from the timeline. The importance of this exclusion cannot be overstated. It demonstrates that the fishing spot hypothesis did not emerge from investigative logic, but from timing, speculation, and coincidence. The fact that the TBI searched Van Hill does not imply that Candace had ever been there. It implies only that the property contains, or was believed to contain, information relevant to the investigation. The search has evidentiary significance independent of Candace's actions, habits, or history. In forensic reconstruction, locations are not interchangeable. They either align with the factual framework, or they do not. Van Hill does not align, and the timeline ensures it cannot. The conclusion is clear. Candace could not have been at Van Hill within the time frame she describes, and Van Hill could not have been her fishing location. This contradiction eliminates the fishing hypothesis entirely and prepares the groundwork for examining the true relevance of Van Hill in the investigation an entirely separate question that cannot be answered through geographic assumption alone. Among all the competing narratives surrounding the disappearance of Summer Wells, one detail stands out because it does not fit neatly into any established theory. It is neither fully dismissed nor fully integrated by investigators, commentators, or the public. It exists in a kind of suspended relevance, a data point that should matter far more than it has been allowed to. This detail originates from the interview given by H, the teenage boy who accompanied Candace and Summer on the afternoon of June 15th. He claimed that at the swimming area, Summer was submerged underwater for 10 to 15 seconds, long enough for him to become alarmed, jump in, and pull her up. The moment, as described, was brief but significant, and it represents a variable with potential physiological implications that were never formally explored. According to H's account, the event unfolded rapidly. Summer went under, did not immediately resurface, and remained submerged long enough for H to perceive the situation as dangerous. His reaction, described as being spooked, was to immediately enter the water and retrieve her. He did not describe her panicking or thrashing. Rather, his concern stemmed from the duration of submersion and the absence of visible movement. In a forensic context, the length of submersion is material. 10 to 15 seconds is not, by itself, a life-threatening interval for a typical child swimming in controlled conditions. However, for a child of Summer's age and developmental profile, unexpected submersion and delayed resurfacing can carry medical consequences, particularly if water is aspirated. What occurred immediately afterward is equally relevant. H reported that when he returned home later that day, he felt unwell emotionally and mentally. His mother described him as not himself, shut down, and unusually quiet. He did not engage in conversation and exhibited what could be interpreted as stress-related withdrawal. While it is impossible to attribute this behavior solely to the underwater event, it is noteworthy because it reflects the impact the incident had on him. Forensic psychology does not rely on emotional interpretation, but changes in demeanor following a stressful event often indicate that the event was perceived as significant by the witness. At minimum, it shows that H believed the moment carried risk. In contrast, the underwater incident does not appear in Candace's timeline of the day. She has described the swimming outing in simple, uneventful terms, without mention of any complication or any moment of distress for Summer. Her omission is notable because a submersion long enough to alarm a teenager would reasonably be expected to register as a memorable event. Whether the omission was intentional, accidental, or the result of differing perceptions is unknown. What matters in forensic reconstruction is the presence of an unacknowledged physiological variable. Medical literature on pediatric submersion incidents shows that even brief episodes of underwater aspiration can lead to delayed onset symptoms, including fatigue, irritability, coughing, decreased responsiveness, or respiratory complications. These effects can occur within minutes or hours following the event, depending on the amount of water inhaled and the child's physical condition. While there is no evidence that Summer suffered any medical distress after the submersion, the mere possibility introduces uncertainty into the afternoon timeline. It creates a variable that could alter demeanor, behavior, or energy levels, and such a variable cannot be dismissed simply because it does not fit established narratives. The challenge is that this detail does not map cleanly onto any of the dominant theories about what occurred later that evening. It does not support the walk-away theory because medical distress would impair mobility rather than facilitate self-directed movement. It does not strongly support an abduction theory unless one assumes vulnerability made the child an easier target. Nor does it directly reinforce a household incident explanation because the event occurred away from the property. Instead, it creates a third trajectory, a medical uncertainty that neither proves nor disproves any theory but undermines the stability of Candace's account. In the absence of corroboration, the underwater incident remains in an ambiguous classification, a medical stress event of unknown significance. But its importance lies not in proving a cause, but in demonstrating the inconsistency between accounts. H's description forces analysts to question the reliability of Candace's omission. When reconstructing a forensic timeline, the presence of an unreported stressor can indicate incomplete or filtered recollection. Even if the omission was benign, it introduces a discrepancy that undermines claim continuity. Furthermore, the underwater event establishes a behavioral divergence between H and Candace. H interpreted the incident as alarming. Candace, based on her omission, did not. This difference in perception is material. It shows that the adults and youths present during the swimming outing experienced the same moment differently. When reconstructing events that rely heavily on personal testimony, such perceptual divergence must be examined as a potential source of timeline distortion. From a forensic standpoint, the underwater event also matters because it creates a new point of medical vulnerability in Summer's day, one that could theoretically influence later behavior or physical state. Forensic analysis does not claim that the event caused harm. It simply identifies that a physiological variable existed and was omitted by one witness while emphasized by another. Any variable that alters the baseline condition of a missing person must be treated as potentially relevant. The question then becomes, why was this moment not mentioned by Candace? Several explanations exist, none conclusive. She may have perceived the event as trivial, especially if Summer resurfaced quickly and seemed unfazed. She may have been distracted by other activities or concerned with multiple children simultaneously. She may have considered the incident too minor to include, or she may have omitted it because it introduced an element of risk that contradicted her statements about the day progressing normally. The absence of this detail from official timelines forces forensic analysts to consider whether other omissions exist. If a medically significant event was not reported, what else may have been excluded? This does not imply deception. It implies the need for greater scrutiny of all statements. It also raises the question of whether Summer displayed any subtle signs of discomfort afterward: fatigue, quietness, changes in movement or balance that were either unnoticed or unreported. While the underwater event does not connect to Van Hill in any direct way, it plays a critical role in undermining the coherence of the broader narrative. It reveals that the day contained moments of risk that were not consistently reported. It introduces physiological uncertainty that no theory fully incorporates. And it demonstrates that even the seemingly stable portions of the timeline the swimming outing contain unresolved inconsistencies. In forensic reconstruction, contradictions accumulate. One contradiction does not dismantle a narrative, but multiple contradictions create instability. The underwater event is one such contradiction. It disrupts the continuity of Candace's account by introducing an unacknowledged moment of potential distress. It challenges the reliability of witness descriptions, and it establishes a medical factor that, while not determinative, adds a layer of complexity to the afternoon. Ultimately, the underwater event matters because it does not fit comfortably anywhere. It is a detail without a category of free-floating anomaly. Yet anomalies often signal weaknesses in larger structures. In this case, the underwater event weakens confidence in the accuracy and completeness of the timeline Candace presents. It shows that not all critical details have been integrated, and it raises the possibility that the later hours of the day may contain similar omissions. This uncertainty requires forensic analysts to treat the afternoon timeline not as a fixed sequence, but as a framework with missing elements. And once the timeline becomes unstable, the exclusion of other locations, such as Van Hill, becomes even more essential. Without a stable timeline, spatial assumptions grow unreliable. The underwater event therefore plays a vital, if indirect, role. It reveals the fragility of the narrative on which the Van Hill theory attempts to build and exposes the need for greater structural scrutiny moving forward. Open-source intelligence (OSINT) has become a powerful tool for independent researchers, amateur investigators, and online communities attempting to reconstruct complex events. When used properly, OSINT can reveal patterns, confirm locations, and highlight inconsistencies long before official information is released. However, when used without methodological discipline, OSINT becomes a generator of errors rather than clarity. In the case of the Summer Wells investigation, the Van Hill fishing spot, theory stands as a textbook example of such an OSINT failure, a narrative built not on evidence, but on misinterpreted images, incorrect geographic assumptions, and the tendency to treat visual resemblance as functional proof. The collapse began with a single misidentification, the mountain ridge visible in Candace's 2020 fishing photograph. Several online creators, believing they had matched the skyline to the hills surrounding the Van Hill property, asserted that the mountain in the background must be part of that region. The claim spread rapidly because the logic seemed simple: mountain ridge in photograph, mountain ridge near searched location, therefore the two must correspond. But when the image was examined by more careful analysts, including those referenced, it became clear that the ridge was Bays Mountain, a recognizable peak near Kingsport, nowhere near Van Hill. The shape of Bays Mountain is distinct, a singular, continuous slope with a recognizable crest. It is visible from select points along the Holston River and the Kingsport Greenbelt, but it is not visible from the Van Hill area due to intervening topographical formations. The Van Hill region features broken ridgelines, lower elevations, and irregular wooded rises. Once the mountain mismatch was identified, the photograph could no longer be credibly linked to Van Hill. Yet the false match had already taken hold, because the initial OSINT work underestimated the precision required in mountain line comparison. A vague resemblance became a false conclusion. The second OSINT error involved identifying a structure in the background of the photograph. The long building with multiple evenly spaced windows, clearly visible behind Candace, was quickly assumed to be a structure associated with the Van Hill property. A shed, equipment building, or one of several privately owned business structures. The assumption was based on superficial similarity rather than architectural analysis. In reality, the building in the photograph aligns with one found along the Kingsport Greenbelt near the riverfront park. The proportions, window layout, orientation, and distance from the water match that location precisely. The Van Hill property, by contrast, contains no such building. The structures there are residential, industrial, or equipment-related, but none resemble the long-windowed facility embedded within the Kingsport municipal corridor. The misidentification occurred because analysts failed to consider perspective distortion, focal length, and the typical industrial architecture found along urban riverbanks. Instead, they viewed the building through the narrow assumption that it must correlate with the location of the TBI search. This is a common OSINT pitfall, allowing the investigative target to dictate the interpretation of unrelated images. The third error, arguably the most fundamental, concerned the water itself. Candace's photograph shows a body of water with the surface characteristics of a flowing river, uneven reflection pattern, subtle current movement, and coloration consistent with the Holston River's TVA-controlled hydrology. The Van Hill Pond, on the other hand, is a retention pond. It has no current, no inflow or outflow channel, and no surface dynamics consistent with a river. Its coloration remains uniform and stagnant, as is typical of artificial ponds designed for drainage or property management. Yet many online analysts treated any water body as interchangeable. The mere existence of a pond on the property became sufficient evidence to declare it the same one in the photograph. The distinctions between river and pond hydrology, depth profile, turbidity, surface texture were overlooked. This simplification reflects a flawed assumption that water always looks like water, and that contextual markers are optional rather than essential. Forensic hydrological comparison requires attention to flow behavior, gradient, bank structure, and environmental surroundings. None of these were considered in the early OSINT conclusions. Together, the misidentified mountain, the misidentified building, and the misidentified water formed a chain of visual errors that reinforced one another. Each incorrect element lent false credibility to the next. Once the search of the Van Hill property became public, these misinterpretations fused into a coherent seeming narrative. Candace fished there, therefore she knew the property. The property was searched, therefore it must be relevant. The pond was in the photo, therefore this was the fishing spot. The narrative loop closed not because of forensic accuracy, but because each OSINT mistake aligned conveniently with the public's need for an explanation during a period of investigative silence. This pattern highlights the central danger of OSENT misuse in active investigations. Visual interpretation can create a powerful illusion of certainty, especially when multiple elements appear to match at first glance. But forensic work demands precision, not approximation. A mountain is not close enough to be considered a match. A building cannot be declared identical because it has multiple windows. A pond cannot be equated with a river simply because both contain water. When investigative reasoning is driven by resemblance rather than verification, conclusions become unstable and easily disproved. Furthermore, these OSENT errors created a distraction that shifted focus away from more relevant investigative vectors. By anchoring the phishing spot theory to Van Hill, online communities inadvertently elevated a false connection and perpetuated a narrative that investigators had never suggested. The TBI search was never linked to recreational activity, phishing habits, or historic visitation patterns. The association existed only in the public sphere, constructed through a chain of flawed visual assumptions. The deeper forensic issue is not the errors themselves, but the mechanism that allowed them to proliferate. People tend to seek patterns, especially in cases marked by long-term uncertainty. When official information is scarce, unofficial theories fill the gap. Without structured evaluation criteria, geographic accuracy, architectural verification, hydrological consistency, visual OSENT becomes a catalyst for misinformation rather than clarity. The Van Hill phishing spot hypothesis persisted because it required no technical knowledge to understand. It offered a simple explanation for a complex investigative action. And in the absence of official guidance, the public accepted the path of least resistance, the idea that the pond in the photograph and the pond on Van Hill must be the same. But as soon as forensic geometry, topographical alignment, hydrological markers, and architectural comparison were applied, the theory disintegrated. Its foundation was not data but visual bias. In the context of the Summer Wells investigation, this collapse is not merely an academic observation. It underscores a broader reality. Public narratives can deviate significantly from forensic truth. The phishing spot hypothesis existed not because evidence supported it, but because OSENT misinterpretation gave it shape. The critical lesson is straightforward. The Van Hill phishing spot theory did not fail due to lack of information. It failed when subjected to correct information. And it is this collapse that prepares the ground for understanding the true significance of Van Hill, an issue unrelated to phishing, photos, or recreational habits, but to something else entirely. The November 13th search on Van Hill Road was one of the most significant investigative actions in the Summer Wells case since 2021, but its significance has been consistently misinterpreted. A central misconception created largely by OSENT errors and reinforced by speculation was that the search implied a connection between Candace's personal habits and the property itself. But the forensic reality is far simpler and far more important. The Van Hill search says nothing about fishing, recreation, or Candace's routine. It speaks only to evidence. And in evaluating what the search communicates, it is equally important to understand what it does not. The first key point is that nothing about the search aligns with the phishing spot hypothesis. Law enforcement did not reference photographs, past outings, or any recreational activity. No agency ever indicated that they believed Candace had visited the property or that any family member had a history of being there. The assumption that Van Hill was linked to a fishing routine came entirely from the public, not from investigative hints. The fact that the pond existed on the property was a coincidence, and one that triggered a cascade of misinterpretations once the phishing photo resurfaced. But in reality, the TBI search was not geographically, behaviorally, or logically matched to the idea of a fishing spot. It was matched only to an investigative lead. The second layer of significance, the part that actually places Van Hill within the investigative landscape, comes from a vector that predates the search: the unresolved red Toyota Tacoma. This Tacoma, described in early TBI bulletins as a 1998 to 2000 model with a ladder rack and white buckets, has remained a persistent anomaly. The driver was never identified, the truck was never confirmed or eliminated, and no publicly released footage ever tied it definitively to the area on June 15th. It remained in what investigators call a dangling lead category, a data point neither disproven nor validated. Such leads often remain dormant unless new information revives them or links them to additional evidence. In the document, it was alleged without verification that a branch of the family associated with the Van Hill property may have owned or had access to a Tacoma matching the description. This has not been confirmed by law enforcement and must be treated with caution, but its existence reveals why the public linked Van Hill to the Tacoma vector. In the absence of clarity, the unresolved truck became a gravitational point for speculation. The search on Van Hill intensified that gravitational pull, leading many to assume the Tacoma had finally been located or implicated. However, the TBI made no such statement. The red Tacoma remains officially unconnected to the search. Its relevance lies not in the search itself, but in demonstrating how unresolved leads can distort public interpretation when reactivated by new events. The third layer of complexity emerges from Candace's own statements, specifically the repeated linguistic slip. "What if I walked out there with her?" This phrase appears multiple times in media interviews. From a forensic linguistic perspective, such a statement is significant. It introduces an unnecessary first-person hypothetical into an account that should be firmly grounded in observation. A parent typically says, "What if she walked out there?" Not, "What if I walked out there with her?" The addition of the first-person pronoun suggests cognitive leakage, a phenomenon in which individuals unintentionally reveal suppressed information through phrasing. While such slips cannot be used to infer guilt, they indicate internal conflict or uncertainty about the sequence of events. This linguistic anomaly does not connect directly to Van Hill, but it destabilizes the timeline and narrative Candace provides. If her account contains structural weaknesses, then the larger timeline becomes vulnerable to reanalysis. However, crucially, even if Candace's statement is interpreted as uncertainty or omission, it does not support the theory that she visited Van Hill for fishing or otherwise. Her slip increases ambiguity, but does not bridge the gap between Ben Hill and Van Hill. If anything, it reinforces the need to evaluate Van Hill based on leads independent of Candace's movements. The fourth component of this forensic landscape comes from TBI's public position. They cannot confirm whether Summer was abducted or walked away. This statement has been repeated over multiple years, reaffirmed even as the Van Hill search unfolded. TBI's reasoning is straightforward. There is no physical evidence confirming either scenario. No footprints, no scent trail extending beyond the driveway, no signs of forced entry, no digital indicators of abduction, and no reliable witnesses placing Summer beyond the immediate area of the home. The absence of evidence leaves both possibilities open, but also indicates that the event did not leave clear forensic trace. This lack of physical evidence is significant because it shapes the investigative approach. If there were signs of abduction, the search areas would have expanded differently in the early stages. If there were signs of a walk-off, tracking efforts would have been concentrated differently. The current ambiguity means that TBI must pursue leads across multiple vectors: familial, environmental, digital, and geographic. Van Hill becomes relevant not because it fits a behavior pattern, but because it fits an investigative pathway that has nothing to do with recreation. The fifth and final point clarifies the true forensic meaning of the Van Hill search. Van Hill is a point within a chain of leads, not a location tied to habit, routine, or personal history. Investigators did not search the property because Candace fished there. They searched because a lead undisclosed but significant enough to justify a warrant directed them to that exact spot. The lead could pertain to a person of interest, a vehicle, a statement, a piece of digital data, or physical evidence previously unlinked to the case. The public may never learn what satisfied the probable cause requirement, but the requirement alone confirms that the search was evidence-driven, not narrative-driven. Therefore, the Van Hill operation tells us three things with certainty. The property contained information investigators believed could be relevant to Summer's disappearance. The search was not connected to Candace's habits, known patterns, or the fishing photograph. The significance of Van Hill lies in investigation, not recreation. At the same time, the search tells us nothing about whether Candace had ever been on the property. whether the Tacoma was present there at any time, whether the search produced results, whether the search confirmed or contradicted any theory about how Summer disappeared. This distinction, what the search says versus what it doesn't, is essential. The public often misinterprets investigative motion as confirmation of a narrative. But searches reveal only that investigators have a question, not that the question has been answered. Van Hill was part of an investigative question, not a behavioral one. In the broader forensic reconstruction of the Summer Wells case, Van Hill cannot be understood as a habitual location. It is a single point in a fragmented investigative map, a location activated by a lead, examined under legal authority, and left unexplained to protect investigative integrity. The fishing spot theory attempted to transform Van Hill into a place of routine activity, but the evidence rejects that interpretation entirely. In the end, the Van Hill search does not clarify how Summer disappeared. Instead, it clarifies where the investigative attention shifted and, equally importantly, where the public misdirected its own attention. The operation underscores the difference between forensic relevance and narrative convenience. And in that distinction lies the key to understanding the real weight of Van Hill. It mattered to investigators not because Candace ever went there, but because evidence, direct or indirect, might have. The attempt to connect Van Hill Road to Candace Bly's favorite fishing spot began as a simple hypothesis, but by the time it circulated through social media, YouTube channels, and community forums, it had transformed into a full narrative. It became the assumed explanation for why the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation returned to a rural property after 4 years of investigative quiet. Yet as each component of the theory is examined, tested, and compared against known facts, a single result emerges repeatedly: Van Hill cannot be the fishing location. The conclusion is not speculative, it is structural. Every measurable vector image analysis, timeline, geography, behavior, and investigative logic excludes the possibility. The first exclusion comes from the forensic analysis of the fishing photograph itself. The image Candace posted in March 2020 contains identifiable visual markers: the silhouette of Bays Mountain, the long multi-windowed building across the water, and the surface characteristics of the Holston River under TVA controlled flow. None of these features exist on or near the Van Hill property. The pond located there is a retention basin, hydrologically stagnant, surrounded by trees, privately owned, and unaligned with any of the geographic or architectural indicators in the photograph. When evaluated using forensic geometry and environmental comparison, the probability that the Van Hill pond matches the fishing site falls to 0. The riverfront in Kingsport matches all markers, Van Hill matches none. The second exclusion is the timeline. Candace has consistently stated that only a 2-minute window existed between the moment she last saw Summer and the moment she discovered her missing. Even allowing for imprecision, 2 minutes is irreconcilable with the 15-minute drive from the Wells home to Van Hill, let alone the return trip. The travel time alone renders the fishing hypothesis impossible. This remains true even if one introduces the Jonesboro vector proposed by some commentators. A 50-minute drive cannot be compressed to fit any version of Candace's account. Forensic timeline reconstruction is unforgiving. Time is fixed, movement is measurable, and contradictions cannot be rationalized through speculation. The third exclusion lies in the geography itself. The Van Hill area is rural but not isolated. It contains a cluster of family-owned properties, multiple driveways, equipment yards, and residential structures. The fishing photograph, however, depicts an open riverbank with clear urban sightlines. There is no vantage point on Van Hill that replicates the terrain, water, mountain alignment, or built environment seen in the 2020 image. Terrain cannot be altered retroactively to fit assumption. The mismatch removes Van Hill from consideration entirely. The fourth exclusion is behavioral patterning. Candace's documented activities show a consistent trend. She favored accessible public locations close to town, particularly along the Kingsport riverfront. She took photos there, brought her children there, and was captured in multiple pictures near the same bridge structure. By contrast, nothing in her known behavioral profile suggests she frequented private ponds on multi-acre rural properties miles from home. Habitual patterns in forensic analysis are not speculative, they offer predictive markers for routine behavior. Van Hill does not align with her documented habits, the Kingsport Greenbelt does. The fifth exclusion concerns the TBI search itself. No investigative statement ever linked the search to Candace's fishing history, personal outings, or recreational patterns. The search was driven by a lead, not by a photograph. The lead required probable cause, not coincidence. The fact that TBI FBI and the Hawkins County Sheriff mobilized for a coordinated operation signifies an evidentiary trigger, not a retrospective interest in a social media image. The fishing spot speculation filled a vacuum left by TBI's silence, but silence does not imply validation. When forensic context is applied, the search points to something far more significant than recreation. If all 5 exclusion categories — image analysis, timeline, geography, behavioral pattern, and investigative action — remove Van Hill as a valid match for the fishing location, the hypothesis collapses entirely. Yet the collapse itself reveals a far more important truth. Van Hill matters for reasons that have nothing to do with Candace's fishing habits. The search occurred at a moment when multiple shock layer developments emerged simultaneously. First, the widely circulated claim that Summer's name had been removed from the FBI missing children database, unconfirmed, but widely discussed, created an atmosphere of investigative shift. Removal from federal systems can occur for various reasons, each carrying procedural implications. While TBI made no comment, the timing fueled public perception that the status of the case had changed. Second, private investigator Jason Jensen revealed that he had received an anonymous tip stating, "Tell him to turn himself in while he still can." Though the credibility and target of the tip remain unknown, the message surfaced shortly before the Van Hill operation. Even without confirmation of its relevance, the convergence of these events produced a sense of escalating investigative tension. Within that tension, Van Hill became symbolic, a location activated by circumstance, charged with meaning simply because it was the only visible point of investigative movement. The public filled every silence surrounding the search with assumptions about fishing, about vehicles, about past behavior, about proximity, about photographed ponds. But the actual meaning of Van Hill cannot be derived from conjecture, it must be derived from what the forensic exclusion pattern reveals. Van Hill is not a fishing spot. Van Hill is not part of Candace's routine. Van Hill is not a location that appears in any verifiable account of the Wells family's movements. Van Hill does not match the terrain or structures in the photograph. Van Hill does not fit the timeline she provides. Van Hill does not accommodate the OSI-driven visual interpretations. But Van Hill is still something. It is a site selected by TBI through a warrant, meaning a judge reviewed the information and found that probable cause existed to search it. It is a location visited by multiple agencies, likely based on data not yet disclosed to the public. It is a property geographically separate from Ben Hill, requiring purposeful transport for any relevant movement. And it is a point that re-entered the investigative narrative just as the case appeared to approach stagnation. In forensic mapping, exclusion of one hypothesis strengthens the need to examine alternative explanations. Eliminating Van Hill as a fishing site clarifies that its importance is evidentiary, not behavioral. The search did not seek to validate a photo, it sought to validate a lead. The collapse of the fishing hypothesis is not a setback, it is a refinement, a narrowing of focus. Removing what Van Hill is not allows investigators to consider what Van Hill might be. Was the search driven by a statement from an individual connected to the property? Was it activated by digital evidence, geolocation, device correlation, or communication patterns? Was it sparked by the unresolved red Toyota Tacoma Vector, re-examined through new context or information? Was it tied to the anonymous tip urging a suspect to surrender? Or was it part of a broader shift in investigative direction linked to the quiet reclassification of federal records? These possibilities exist because exclusion does not diminish significance. If anything, it amplifies it. The fact that Van Hill is not explained by the only public theory surrounding it, the fishing hypothesis, means that the real explanation lies elsewhere, deeper within the investigative record. As the case stands today, only one question remains. If Van Hill has nothing to do with Candace's fishing routines, Then what compelled TBI to target a property 9.6 miles away in the largest search since 2021, and why does their silence about its purpose persist? This is the question that now drives the next stage of forensic inquiry,